In the same year that Marie Curie won her second Nobel Prize, the most powerful institutions in France tried to be rid of her. Its Academy of Sciences shut its door in her face. Its newspapers set out to ruin her name. And one night, a crowd gathered outside her house in the dark and threw stones at the windows, while her two small daughters hid inside, and a voice in the street shouted at her to go home to Poland. It is all in the record. It is just not in the version we kept, because the year France tried to erase Marie Curie is the year her story learned to leave out. Start with the version almost everyone carries: the selfless genius. The first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and the only person ever to win two of them in two different sciences. The woman who discovered radium and then gave it away to the world for free. Who worked quietly and without complaint until the work itself killed her, and was laid to rest beneath the dome of the Panthéon in Paris, a national hero. Calm, luminous, untouchable, the saint of science. If that is the Marie Curie you know a real person. She did win the prizes. She did refuse the fortune. None of that is a lie. But hold the portrait up to the light, because that portrait has an author, and it has a date. The serene, untouchable saint is not how the world treated Marie Curie while she was alive. It is how she was remembered afterward, and the remembering left a year out. Even the name is a kind of editing. We remember a French scientist named Marie. She was born Maria Skłodowska in Warsaw in 1867. In a Poland that, on the official maps of the time, did not exist. It had been carved up by its neighbors and swallowed whole, and the part she was born into belonged to the Russian Empire. She did not become French until she married, at 27, and the very first element she would ever discover, she named after that erased country. So there are two Marie Curies here, the saint in the marble and the foreigner they stoned, and they belong to the same year. One of them was quietly taken out of the frame. I went back to the file to find out which and who did the taking. The portrait we inherited has a first author, and her name was Eve. Eve Curie, Marie's younger daughter. In 1937, 3 years after her mother died, Eve published a biography. She called it, simply, Madame Curie. It was elegant, devoted, beautifully written. And for roughly the next 30 years, it was the only full life of Marie Curie that most of the world could read. It won a National Book Award. It shaped everything that came after. And there is one thing it does not contain. The year the stones were thrown is not in it. The scandal of that year is not in it. A whole chapter of her mother's life is, very gently, not there. 6 years later, Hollywood finished the job. In 1943, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer released a film, also called Madame Curie, with Greer Garson playing Marie. It was nominated for 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture. It was adapted from Eve's book, and it made the same cut, for an additional reason. The studios of that era worked under a strict censorship code, and the missing year could not have passed it. So the film dropped the scandal too. It also dropped her Polish family and her politics. What reached the world on the page and on the screen was the same: a chaste, patient, devoted saint. The complicated woman had been edited out twice. Now I want to be careful, because this is the place where a story like this wants to turn into something it is not. No one sat in a secret room and conspired to invent a saint. A grieving daughter wrote a loving monument to her mother. A film studio, bound by the rules of its time, made a respectable picture. 2 ordinary human acts, love and commerce. But put them side by side and notice what falls into the gap between them. The same year, both of them, independently, reaching for the scissors and cutting out the same 12 months. Which only makes the question louder. What happened in that year that a daughter could not write down and a studio could not show? To understand the year, you have to understand the foreigner. Maria Skłodowska grew up under occupation, in a Warsaw where her own language and history were being scrubbed out of the schools by the Russian authorities. So she learned in secret. There was a thing in Poland then that people called the Flying University, an illegal underground school with no building of its own that moved from one private apartment to the next to stay ahead of the police. Young women who were barred from the real university studied there. That is where Marie Curie's education began. Not in a grand hall, in borrowed rooms, against the law. She had no money, so she and her older sister Bronisława made a pact between them. Marie would work first, as a governess for a wealthy family in the countryside, sending her wages to Paris so Bronisława could study medicine. And once Bronisława qualified and could earn, she would pay for Marie's turn. They funded each other, one sister at a time, out of almost nothing. It worked. Marie reached Paris. She enrolled at the Sorbonne. She finished first in her class in physics, and the next year took a second degree in mathematics. And in 1895, she married a quiet French physicist named Marie Curie in a small civil ceremony with no white dress and no ring. The work they did together has become legend, and the legend, for once, undersells it. They were chasing a faint, impossible energy coming out of certain rocks, and to catch it, they worked in a converted shed, a leaking wooden hangar that one visiting chemist described as a cross between a stable and a potato shed. Inside it, Marie boiled down tons of a black ore called pitchblende by hand in great vats, stirring with an iron rod nearly as tall as she was to pull out a few specks of something new. In 1898, she announced two new elements. One she called radium. The other she named Polonium, after Poland, after the country that wasn't on the map. A new thing in the universe, named to remind the world of an injustice. Hold on to that, it comes back. In 1903 came the first Nobel Prize, in physics, shared with Pierre and with a colleague, Henri Becquerel. And here is the first crack in the saint story. Very early, easy to miss. The French committee that put the names forward had, at first, left Marie off entirely. The prize was going to go to the two men. A Swedish mathematician who believed women belonged in science quietly warned Pierre what was happening. Pierre wrote back and refused to accept it without her. Her name was added. The first woman ever to win a Nobel Prize nearly didn't, because the people handing it out had simply not thought to include her. She got there because a man flagged it, and her husband insisted. Then, in 1906, the ground gave way. On a rainy April day in Paris, Marie Curie stepped into the street, slipped, and fell beneath the wheels of a heavy horse-drawn wagon. It crushed his skull. He died instantly. Marie was 38, a widow with two small daughters. The university offered her Pierre's teaching chair, and she took it, becoming the first woman ever to teach at the Sorbonne. When she walked in to give her first lecture, she did not eulogize him. She picked up the science roughly where he had left off. She was by now the most accomplished woman in French science, which is exactly what made her dangerous to a certain kind of man. Which brings us finally to the year 1911. It opens with a vote. There was an open seat at the Académie des Sciences, the most prestigious scientific body in France. The seat once associated with Pierre's field. Marie Curie stood for it. By every measure of achievement, she was the obvious choice. And the campaign against her was vicious. The conservative nationalist press attacked her as a foreigner, an intruder, a Pole who did not belong. They dismissed her as nothing more than her dead husband's assistant, and they reached for the cheapest weapon available. They invented a smear, and I am going to quote the lie exactly because it matters that you hear what was actually said. They called her a foreign Jewish homewrecker. She was not Jewish. She had been born into a Polish Catholic family and had become, as an adult, a non-believer. The accusation was simply false. But the press of the French nationalist right had learned, in those years, that the fastest way to turn a foreigner into an enemy was to attach that word to her, true or not. So they did. And on the 23rd of January, 1911, the Academy voted. She lost. The first round was 29-28, the runoff 30-28. By 2 votes, the most distinguished body in French science decided it would rather not have her. She never put her name forward again. Now watch the calendar, because the calendar is where it becomes almost unbearable. On the 4th of November, 1911, a Paris newspaper, Le Journal, ran a front-page story exposing a love affair between Marie Curie and a man named Paul Langevin, a physicist, married, and a former student of her late husband. 3 days later, on the 7th of November, the Swedish Academy announced that Marie Curie had won the Nobel Prize again, this time in chemistry alone, for the discovery of radium and polonium. The scandal broke first. The second Nobel arrived 3 days behind it. France met its greatest living scientist that week as a disgraced woman first and a laureate second. To be clear about what was real, the relationship had happened, and Langevin's marriage was already breaking apart. But the way it became public was not a confession, it was a theft. Earlier that year, someone had broken into the apartment where the two of them met and stolen their private letters. Those letters made their way to the newspapers through a relative of Langevin's wife, a crime reporter. So her most intimate correspondence, taken in a burglary, was now being printed for the entertainment of the country. And then it escalated. On the 23rd of November, an editor named Gustave Thierry published the stolen letters in detail, in a long, lurid special edition. That is the night the crowd came to her house in the suburb of Sceaux. They gathered in the dark outside, shouting. Someone threw a stone at the windows. Inside were Marie and her daughters, Irène, 14, and Ève, who was 7. A voice in the crowd shouted at her to go home to Poland. Her friends had to get them out. A mathematician named Émile Bohel and his wife took the family in. Another colleague's wife looked after the girls, and a chemist, André Debierne, walked Marie and little Ève out through the mob. The most accomplished woman in French science, hiding from a stone-throwing crowd. In the same month, she won her second Nobel Prize. The fury spilled into the press itself, and men began fighting duels over her name. Though, notice carefully who was bleeding. It was her defenders. A journalist who had written in her favor was wounded by Thierry. Another of her defenders was wounded by the editor of the nationalist paper. Langevin himself challenged Thierry to a duel with pistols. And on the morning it was to happen, neither man fired a shot. And from outside France, one letter arrived that took her side without hesitation. Albert Einstein wrote to her while the scandal was at its worst and told her to ignore the attackers. He called them rabble. He called them vermin. He told her not to read the hogwash they were printing. But the rabble was not the worst of it. The worst of it came from the institution that was supposed to be honoring her. Because as Marie Curie prepared to travel to Stockholm to collect that second Nobel Prize, a letter reached her from the chairman of the Nobel Committee himself, a chemist named Svante Arrhenius. And the letter asked her not to come. It suggested she should send word that she would not accept the prize, not until some future trial had cleared her name of the Langevin affair. Sit with that. She had already won it. The work was done. The discovery was real. The decision was made. And the institution awarding the prize was quietly asking the laureate to stay home because her private life had become an embarrassment. She refused. She wrote back, and her answer is the cleanest sentence in this whole story. She told them there is no connection between her scientific work and the facts of her private life. The prize, she said, had been given for the discovery of radium and polonium. And a discovery does not become less true because the person who made it has been slandered. And then she got on the train. She went to Stockholm. On the 10th and 11th of December 1911, she accepted the prize in person and delivered her Nobel lecture, against the explicit advice of the man who ran the committee, while the newspapers back home were still printing her letters. She made them hand it to her. It nearly destroyed her. About a month after she came home with that second Nobel Prize, Marie Curie collapsed. She was hospitalized, a severe kidney illness, and a deep depression. She had surgery the following year. For most of 1912, the most famous scientist in the world simply disappeared from public life, too ill and too broken to work. That is the price the canon leaves out. The double Nobel, the triumph we teach, was bought with a year of public humiliation and a body that gave out under the weight of it. And the door the Academy shut on her in January? It stayed shut for 51 years. The Académie des Sciences did not admit a single woman until 1962, and the woman it finally let in had been Marie Curie's own student. So step back and look at what the missing year actually contains. A national academy that rejected her, a press that invented a slur to do it, A burglary turned into public theater, a mob at her door, and the prize committee itself asking her not to show up. Now you can see why a daughter writing in love and a studio writing for the box office both reached for the same scissors. The year does not fit the saint. But here is the part that should change how you hear the rest. The cleaning up did not start with Eve's book in 1937. The world had been simplifying Marie Curie while she was still alive, including the single most famous virtue we credit her with. We say she gave radium away for free, that she discovered the most valuable substance on Earth and refused to patent it, so that it would belong to all of humanity. The refusal is real, and the principle was real. She believed the science should be open, but the clean version hides two things. The first is the law. Under the French law of that time, a married woman could not have held that patent in her own name anyway. The rights would have passed to her husband. The second is what it cost her later. By 1920, the woman who discovered radium could no longer afford to buy any. A single gram cost about $100,000, and she did not have it. The selfless gift and the empty laboratory are the same story, told at two different times. How she finally got her gram of radium tells you something too. It did not come from France. It came from American women. A journalist named Marie Melanie ran a campaign across the United States. Women donating dollar by dollar, and they raised enough to buy her a gram of the element she had given the world. In 1921, she sailed to America, and the president, Warren Harding, handed it to her at the White House. The discoverer of radium had to be given some, as charity, by the public of another country. But the deepest gap between the saint and the record is not about money. It is about a war, and what France did with her afterward. When the First World War began, Marie Curie did something most people have never heard about. She understood that X-rays could find bullets and shrapnel inside wounded men, and that the army had almost no way to use them at the front. So she built one. She equipped a fleet of about 20 mobile X-ray units, cars fitted out as little radiology stations, which the soldiers nicknamed the Petite Curies, the Little Curies. She set up some 200 more fixed posts. She trained around 150 women to operate them, and she drove to the front herself with her daughter Irene, 17 years old, working beside her. The number of wounded men examined with the equipment she built runs to an estimated 1 million. Estimated is the honest word. The records do not give a clean count. But the scale is real. She tried to give even more. She offered to donate her 2 Nobel medals, the gold itself, to the war effort. She said she would give up the little gold she possessed and add the scientific medals, which were, she said, quite useless to her. The Bank of France refused to take them. She put her prize money into French war bonds instead, and she expected to lose it, and largely did. She gave France her science, her medals, her money, and 2 years at the front. And for that war work, the French government gave her formally almost nothing. No great honor, no official thanks. The nation that would one day bury her as a hero could not, while she lived, bring itself to say thank you. And then there is how she died, which is the part of the legend that feels truest, and is the part I have to handle most carefully. The story we tell is that radium killed her, that she was martyred by her own discovery, having handled it for decades with no idea of its danger. She did die of it, in a sense. On the 4th of July, 1934, Marie Curie died of a blood disease, aplastic anemia, the kind caused by radiation. She had carried glowing tubes of it in her pockets. She had kept it by her bed because she loved the light it gave off in the dark. The danger was real, and for years almost no one understood it. But the clean martyrdom may not be quite right either. When her body was exhumed in 1995, France's Radiation Safety Agency measured her remains and found surprisingly little radium in them. Too little, they concluded, to have been what killed her. Their reading points somewhere else, not to the radium in the lab, but to the war. To years spent beside unshielded X-ray machines at the front, taking doses no one was counting. I want to be careful, because it would be easy to swap one tidy story for another. This does not solve how Marie Curie died. It complicates it. But notice where it points. The exposure that most likely killed her may have come from the very war service that France never bothered to thank her for. And in those same years, while radium was quietly damaging the woman who discovered it, the world was selling it as a miracle. There was a radium craze. Radium in tonics, in face cream, in water you were supposed to drink for your health. In American factories, young women were painting watch dials with radium paint, wetting the brushes with their lips, and they began to die of it, their jaws crumbling. That is not Marie Curie's doing. She did not run those factories, and she did not sell that quackery. But it is the same element in the same decades. When she was asked about those dying factory women late in her life, she said the one thing she was certain of, that once radium enters the human body, there is absolutely no means of destroying it. She, of all people, knew. So here is the record reassembled. A Polish immigrant, educated against the law, who twice forced a scientific establishment to recognize her almost against its will, who was rejected by her national academy, slandered with a lie, exposed by a burglary, stoned in her own home, and asked by the Nobel Committee not to come, who gave France a fortune, her medals, and the frontline medicine of a war, and was thanked with silence, and who was then, after her death, gently rewritten into a serene and uncomplicated saint by people who loved her and by a country that found the saint easier to admire than the woman it had actually treated so badly. The familiar version is not false. It is incomplete, and the incompleteness was the point. Which brings us to the ending, the real one, the one that happened long after she was gone. In 1995, 61 years after her death, France finally did the thing it had refused to do in her lifetime. The president, François Mitterrand, had her remains and Pierre's moved into the Panthéon, the marble temple in Paris where the nation buries its greatest figures. And as he did it, Mitterrand said something that, if you have been listening, lands like a verdict on the whole story. He called her the first woman in the history of France to be honored there for her own merits. It is worth knowing exactly what that careful phrase means. One woman was already inside the Panthéon before her, but she had been placed there as a wife to lie beside her husband. Marie Curie was the first woman France carried into that temple for what she herself had done. In 1911, they had thrown stones at her windows and told her to go home to Poland. In 1995, they carried her by name into the heart of the nation. The same country. The verdict simply took 84 years to arrive. And standing there at the ceremony, among the guests, was the president of Poland. A Poland that, by then, was finally a free country on the map again. Which is the moment that quiet thing from the beginning comes back. Remember the element she named after a country that did not exist? Polonium, named for an erased and occupied Poland, a piece of grief smuggled onto the periodic table? The press had once used that same foreignness as a weapon. Go home to Poland, they shouted at her door. And now, at the end, the president of a Poland that had come back from the dead stood in a French temple to watch her honored. The name she gave to a country that wasn't there had outlived the empire that erased it. The foreignness they tried to shame her with became, in the end, the thing two nations claimed. But the marble is not quite the last word, because Marie Curie's story has a strange refusal to end. Her daughter Irene, the 17-year-old who had worked the X-ray vans at the front, became a scientist too, and won her own Nobel Prize in chemistry in 1935. And in 1956, Irene died of leukemia, the same family of radiation illness that had taken her mother. The cost did not stop with the woman who discovered it. It was inherited. The harm went down a generation, quietly, the way the rest of the record went quiet. And the work itself is still dangerous to touch. Marie Curie's laboratory notebooks, the actual pages where she wrote down the discovery of radium in her own hand in the 1890s, are still radioactive. They are kept in lead-lined boxes. To read them, a researcher has to put on protective clothing and sign a waiver accepting the risk. Radium decays so slowly that those notebooks will stay dangerous for something like another 1,500 years. Think about what that means. The clean marble saint is sealed in the Panthéon, but the real record of her work sits in a lead box, still emitting, still active, still, in the most literal sense, open. She told the Nobel Committee, in the worst week of her life, that there was no connection between her scientific work and the facts of her private life. She was right, and it took the world 84 years, a stone-throwing mob, a stolen bundle of letters, 2 sanitized retellings, and finally a state funeral to admit she was right. The saint they built is real enough, but she was never the whole record. The whole record is harder and angrier and far more alive. A woman who was hounded in the exact year she triumphed, edited down by people who meant well, and proven right only after she was safely gone. The official ending made her easy to admire. Put the missing year back, and she becomes something better than a saint. She becomes true.